So then what are we going to make of all of this? Well, the approach that I take is to recognize that scripture itself doesn't actually say the word human or humankind or mankind or anything like that. The word from human in Genesis that we translate that way is actually Adam. It's the same word that's used for Adam's proper name. And it's funny, both Nathan and I are scientists in the public square. They're really focused on this question of what it means to be human. Nathan's written 2 really excellent books on this. He has another one coming out too. And there's several chapters in the book where I really engage this both from a scientific, a theological, a historical, and a scriptural point of view. And this is actually, I think, where all of the conversation gets really the most interesting. For example, most people don't realize that science doesn't actually give us a definition of human. We don't actually get that from science. You can say Homo sapien, but there's really no clear definition of Homo sapien. And that's also, a very scientific term. If you talk to Paul 2,000 years ago about Homo sapiens that lived 100,000 years ago, he wouldn't have known that those humans existed. And he certainly didn't know about Neanderthals or the Homo genus, and other scientists really talk about that. Ian Tattersall speaks very eloquently about how we are preoccupied as ourselves as a species about ourselves, but for some reason have just never been able to figure out scientifically what human is. So that's the reality. Science just doesn't tell us. Theology actually doesn't really tell us either. There's a large number of views. And what's really interesting is the parallel that's going on between both the scientists and the theologians. We did 2 workshops on the book. Nathan was kind to come to one of them with theologians of many sorts, but also scientists, both Christians and non-Christians, and Christians that affirmed Adam and Eve and those that didn't. And it was striking how much disagreement there was amongst the theologians on how to understand what human was as well. And of course, there's a history here. The traditions of the church are important because it does seem, when you study the monogenesis tradition in the church and the rejection of polygenesis, which this is actually not a version of polygenesis, you see that one of the demands of orthodoxy seems to be that if Adam and Eve exist, then we all descend from them. So then what are we going to make of all of this? Well, the approach that I take is to recognize that scripture itself doesn't actually say the word human or humankind or mankind or anything like that. The word from human in Genesis that we translate that way is actually Adam. It's the same word that's used for Adam's proper name. So it has a double meaning. It can either mean humanity or it can mean Adam. And in fact, it seems across the entire conversation, everyone agrees that in the Christian conversation, I should say, everyone agrees that the way how scripture defines human is Adam, Eve, and their descendants. And that's not a statement about there being no humanness outside the garden. Humanness is different than being human per se, because remember, we're talking about the language of scripture here. And so I think one way to understand scripture is to say that it's really about the rise of Adam, Eve, and their descendants, the humans of scripture, the humans to whom scripture is referring, without really speaking about people outside the garden. And we have good reason to believe that they had full humanness, even though they aren't the humans to which scripture is referring.
Right.
So with that, you see that Adam and Eve really are the first humans by that technical narrow definition across the globe. There's been no humans before them. And really, the story of scripture begins with them.
And then, of course, when you come to sort of once they leave the garden in that story and, their children start to have relations with others, it appears actually as soon as you leave the garden that there are other people around, and that it's not that the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve had to mate together in order to have offspring, that they were going and so do you think that this kind of gets overlooked sometimes by the young earth creationists and so on, in terms of that there was some kind of...
Well, yeah, so it's not overlooked in the sense that if you can read young earth creationist literature, or even old earth creationist literature, it's just known to be a friction point. So there's often, especially in young earth creationism, fairly fantastical scenarios dreamed up for explaining Cain's wife, the people that inhabited the city, why he was afraid and needed a mark. and it requires like some intricate gap theories in Genesis 4 and reordering chapter 5 so it comes before chapter 4. It's fairly dramatic backflips that are taken there. So I wouldn't say they ignore it. It's just that it's a major difficulty point. And now if you actually look at the history of the church, you find out that people have been wondering about that for a very, very, very long time. So I think the right way to look at this is that scripture itself seems to hint that there's people outside the garden, and it's been a mystery. People haven't known. So the way I define the traditional account is that Adam and Eve were ancestors of us all relatively recently, less than 10,000 years ago, and de novo created out of the dust in a rib. But it also includes mystery, lacunae, or gaps in the account that are filled in different ways. Now, one way to fill that is with these imaginative young earth creationist scenarios about how how these people really are descended from Adam and Eve, though the text doesn't say that. The other way is to take them, more plain, natural reading, consistent with the tradition of the church, that there were just people out there.